If you want to improve your flexibility for higher kicks as fast as possible and also maintain those gains long term, should you be focusing on dynamic stretching or static stretching? According to modern science, the short answer is that we need to do both. So let's break it all down. By the way, if you don't know me, my name is PJ May. Some people know me as the Flexibility Maestro, and I've been coaching flexibility to fighters since 2020, which at the time of recording this is over 6 years ago now. And the reason that I make content like this is because there's a lot of athletes struggling with their kicking flexibility right now, and I don't want you to be one of them. So when we look through the lens of biomechanics, throwing a high kick is obviously an expression of dynamic flexibility, and there's a lot of good evidence in the scientific literature to suggest that dynamic stretching is the most effective way to directly improve our dynamic flexibility. But there's some very important nuances that need to be taken into consideration when we're talking about achieving the more extreme ranges of motion that high kick techniques require. Because for most naturally stiff athletes, relying on dynamic stretching alone is not enough to create the long-lasting changes in our high kick flexibility that we're ultimately looking for. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the current science to break down where dynamic stretching falls short and how static stretching and loaded stretching protocols serve to improve our high kick flexibility. Then once you have the full picture of what the science says, I'm going to provide you with a structured flexibility plan to optimize your results so that you can unlock your very first head kick. Let me start by saying that I think dynamic stretching is a great tool that is very useful for unlocking high kicks. I've been including it in my programming for years. However, in my opinion, it's only one piece of the puzzle. I believe a good, comprehensive training plan for high kick flexibility needs to include the full scope of flexibility training rather than just isolating one component of it. But before I get too deep into that, let's quickly go over the main benefits that dynamic stretching has over static stretching. When it comes to high kick flexibility, dynamic stretching excels in the specificity of the task. Kicking someone in the head requires you to explosively move through large ranges of motion with high velocity. So by exposing the body to that dynamic stimulus, you'll be able to acutely desensitize the stretch reflex to better prepare your nervous system for high velocity lengthening. And if you're wondering what the stretch reflex even is, it's basically just a neurological defense mechanism built into our body that actively resists the movement of a kick to protect the joint from overextending into a range that it perceives as dangerous. So when you expose your muscles to a sudden high velocity stretch, the rapid lengthening triggers the stretch reflex to involuntarily contract the muscles being stretched and restrict your range of motion to actually resist the movement. This study published in Experimental Physiology took a look at the acute effects of dynamic stretching and found that it significantly reduced spinal reflex activity immediately after the protocol. In this case, spinal reflex activity served as a proxy for the stretch reflex loop. However, this effect was very temporary, returning to baseline within 7 minutes after the protocol. But dynamic stretching has a couple other benefits that are worth mentioning as well. This 2019 study in the Journal of Sports Science and Medicine took a deeper look at the acute and sustained benefits of dynamic stretching and found that while the neuromuscular gains only lasted around 15 minutes, the resulting improvements in joint range of motion and reduced passive muscle stiffness can last for up to 90 minutes post-intervention. So what the science highlights is that dynamic stretching offers some really profound acute benefits for high kicks immediately after doing it. It can work really well as a warm-up to increase range of motion, prepare our nervous system for explosive high-velocity movements, and make you feel a little less stiff for a while. But these benefits are temporary and highly reversible. When it comes to long-term data, there isn't any strong scientific evidence to suggest that dynamic stretching creates lasting changes in range of motion, stretch tolerance, or passive muscle stiffness. What the long-term data actually reveals is that dynamic stretching falls significantly short when compared to static stretching and loaded eccentric stretching. This is exactly why I don't believe that dynamic stretching alone is a complete solution for most people to see the long-lasting high kick flexibility gains that they're looking for. It has some great acute benefits for martial artists, but it also has some major drawbacks and limitations as well. Since dynamic stretching involves rapid movements where the muscle is only being lengthened into an end range position for a fraction of a second, it just simply does not apply the type of structural and neurological stress that's required to make long-lasting changes to our baseline range of motion, especially in individuals who are naturally stiff and have poor initial flexibility to begin with. This is exactly where static and loaded stretching protocols come into play to bridge those gaps and directly expand the boundaries of range of motion that dynamic movements can safely occur in. This meta-analysis, published in the Journal of Sport and Health Science, confirmed that long-term static stretching produces significantly greater chronic gains in joint range of motion compared to dynamic or ballistic stretching protocols. So this study is literally telling us that static stretching is proven to be more effective for chronically expanding the physical limitations or boundaries of the muscle tendon unit. And what's even more interesting is that a 2025 study in the European Journal of Applied Physiology showed that loaded eccentric stretching yielded more than twice the acute range of motion increase compared to static stretching. And it also produced greater changes in passive tissue stiffness and stretch tolerance. The study also noted significant carryover effects after just 2 sessions of eccentric training, which suggests that it's a much more potent structural stimulus for creating long-lasting changes in muscle compliance. So the modern scientific consensus for long-term flexibility gains actually ranks loaded eccentric stretching at the top as the most effective method, static stretching is a close second, and dynamic stretching is at the bottom as the least effective method. Now, if we just pause and zoom out for a second to take a look at the bigger picture here, right off the bat, we can see that those are 2 very complementary outcomes as it pertains to high kick flexibility. This means we can use static stretching and loaded stretching to chronically improve our overall range of motion, and then we can teach our legs how to use that new range in a more dynamic application with things like dynamic stretching and end-range agonist strength exercises. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. The deeper we look into the limitations of dynamic stretching and the benefits of static stretching, loaded stretching, and agonist activations, the clearer the picture becomes that these are simply just 2 sides of the same coin that need to be trained simultaneously. Especially when we're talking about a really stiff athlete whose range of motion is already very limited to begin with. That's where dynamic stretching truly falls short in the absence of proper static and loaded stretching protocols. But if you're still not convinced, keep watching, because this is where the science gets very interesting. Now, before I go any further, I think it's really important that you understand the fundamental relationship between the agonist and antagonist muscle groups as it pertains to dynamic movements. The agonist muscle is the primary mover. It contracts and shortens to generate the movement of the joint. The antagonist is the opposing muscle. It relaxes and lengthens to accommodate the contraction on the closing side of the joint. And this is fundamentally true for any movement of any joint in your body. In order to move a joint, one side needs to contract and the other needs to relax in order to lengthen. So that means our dynamic flexibility depends on our ability to combine relaxation of the antagonist muscles that are being lengthened with a strong contraction of the agonist muscles, which are shortening to generate the movement. In my experience, it's very rare for a naturally stiff athlete who possesses a high baseline mechanical stiffness to be able to produce enough force in the agonist muscles to overcome the mechanical resistance of the antagonist muscles enough to safely reach head kick ranges. And again, this is one of the major limitations of dynamic stretching because the muscle is only extended into a lengthened position for a fraction of a second. You're accumulating very little time under tension in those fully lengthened end ranges. Like I said before, according to all the scientific literature, such a brief exposure is mechanically insufficient to create lasting reductions in the passive structural drag that basically acts like a heavy resistance band that's pulling the leg back down when you throw a kick. And this is yet another problem that we can solve with a healthy combination of static stretching and loaded eccentric stretching. It's going to allow us to expose our body to a sufficient mechanical stress in those lengthened end ranges to make long-lasting improvements in our stretch tolerance, our passive mechanical tension, and our overall range of motion. But what's interesting is that static stretching and loaded stretching achieve very similar outcomes, which are superior to dynamic stretching, but they do so by targeting very different mechanisms in the body. Static stretching primarily alters nervous system sensitivity, while loaded stretching drives a structural remodeling of the tissues through the process of sarcomerogenesis, which is basically just a fancy way of saying that you are physically laying down new tissue and literally making the muscle longer. This is why I think a proper, well-rounded training plan needs to emphasize combining them together. This 2024 study published in the Journal of Sport and Health Science tracked the biceps femoris longhead over 9 weeks of eccentric training and proved that a significant increase in fascicle length was directly caused by the addition of sarcomeres in series. This is evidence to confirm that loaded eccentric stretching actually drives sarcomerogenesis and legitimately makes your muscles longer. That study also suggested that the increased fascicle length, muscle hypertrophy, and enhanced strength induced by the 9-week training routine could plausibly provide protection against muscle strain injuries, which actually makes a lot of sense because the high mechanical load has also been proven to stimulate collagen synthesis and remodel the tendons to increase the load-bearing capacity of the muscle tendon unit. For example, this study from the Scandinavian Journal of Medicine and Science in Sports found that chronically injured Achilles tendons responded to 12 weeks of eccentric training by increasing collagen synthesis rate without any increase in collagen breakdown. That means loaded eccentric stretching is not only making our muscles longer through sarcomerogenesis, but it's also remodeling our tendons to be more resilient to injuries. And that's not all. This study published in the Journal of Applied Physiology confirmed that the process of sarcomerogenesis induced by loaded eccentric stretching has been scientifically proven to reduce passive mechanical tension at longer tissue lengths because adding sarcomeres in series acts like adding extra links into an overly tight chain. Said differently, when you stretch your joint to a specific angle, like in a high kick for example, a muscle with more serial sarcomeres experiences less mechanical strain per individual unit compared to a shorter muscle. This structural remodeling drastically reduces the overall passive tension and resistance that you're going to feel at that given angle when you lift your leg up to throw a high kick. So basically what this all means is that loaded eccentric stretching will help you safely kick higher by reducing the passive mechanical stiffness that resists our dynamic movements and building structural strength at the end range to reduce the risk of injury with ballistic movements that move us into a lengthened position. But before we move on, I want to quickly talk about the importance of static stretching in this equation. What static stretching does exceptionally well is improve our stretch tolerance. Since it allows us to accumulate a lot of unbroken time under tension in end range positions, it helps us to desensitize our nervous system in those lengthened ranges. Over time, this can gradually shift our brain's perception of what constitutes a dangerous length, allowing us to safely navigate larger ranges of motion with less of the protective muscle guarding from the stretch reflex. So that means we can indirectly expand the available range for our dynamic movements. Now, if you've been following me so far, what we've just proven is that static stretching and loaded stretching help to improve your overall dynamic flexibility potential by allowing the antagonist muscle to do a better job of relaxing and lengthening to accommodate the contraction of the agonist muscles much better. But what happens if we improve the contractile strength of the agonist muscle group that's responsible for lifting our leg up into that high kick position? This study in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research split athletes into different groups to isolate variables. One group focused strictly on strengthening the agonist muscles, while the others focused on stretching the antagonists. The researchers found that the agonist strengthening protocol revealed superior improvements in active range of motion compared to standard moderate to high intensity stretching. They explicitly concluded that interventions based on strengthening the agonist muscles are highly beneficial for developing active ranges of motion and are severely overlooked. And what's even more interesting is that this study was conducted on dance students who share similar demands to those of martial artists. And the agonist strength training group was prescribed to focus on end range hip flexor strength exercises. So it's pretty fair to extrapolate that these results would translate directly to high kick flexibility. Now, I know this video is probably a lot of information to take in, but hopefully now you're starting to see the full picture of why dynamic stretching alone is not enough for most stiff athletes to unlock high kick flexibility. That's why it's so critically important to utilize the full scope of flexibility training if we want to achieve that outcome as fast as possible and have it stick with us for a long time. Now, in the beginning of this video, I promised that I would provide you with a structured flexibility plan to optimize your results. So let's take all the pieces of this puzzle and assemble them into one cohesive routine. In order to structure our flexibility training, the first thing that we need to take into consideration is the recovery cost of each of these different modalities. Dynamic stretching is universally shown to have an exceptionally low recovery cost in normal conditions of volume and duration. This means that it's the type of thing that can, and ideally should, be done with a high frequency exposure if you want to maintain the more temporary benefits of it. On the other hand, when we take a look at loaded eccentric stretching, that has a much higher recovery cost. Since the mechanical tension is so high with loaded stretching, the magnitude of the signal to adapt to is just much greater. A single high intensity stimulus triggers a massive protein synthesis cascade that can sometimes take days to recover from, which makes high weekly frequencies of loaded stretching unnecessary and counterproductive. especially if your weekly training routine includes martial arts training or even strength and conditioning. Being sore from stretching all the time is just going to have some negative impacts on our overall progress. But what's interesting is that in the academic literature, interventions utilizing as little as 1 to 2 sessions per week demonstrate significant chronic increases in flexibility, structural remodeling, and shifted injury thresholds. So we don't even need a high frequency. Now, static stretching is somewhere in the middle when it comes to recovery costs, but it really does depend on how you're using it. When we consider the neurological stress that it induces, the recovery cost is definitely higher than dynamic stretching, but certainly not as extreme as loaded eccentric stretching. For the sake of simplicity and efficiency in programming, I tend to combine it with loaded stretching and end range agonist strength work within the same sessions. So just to recap, what we've established here is that dynamic stretching is a low-hanging fruit that should definitely be done on a high frequency basis. Then we just need 1 to 2 dedicated flexibility workouts per week that combine our loaded stretching, static stretching, and agonist strength exercises together. That is a scientifically well-rounded approach that maximizes our high kick flexibility gains while minimizing our recovery cost as much as possible. So now that we've established a structure of volume, frequency, and recovery, let's talk about what those sessions should actually look like. Starting with your dynamic stretching sessions, I want you to think of this kind of like a daily supplement. All we need is 5 to 10 minutes per day of dynamic stretch kicks, aiming to get roughly 2 sets of 10 to 20 repetitions per side, and just swing your legs in all different directions. It can work great as a warm-up for martial arts on training days, and is also just as good to be done in the mornings of your off days as well. As for the dedicated flexibility workouts, the approach that typically works best for me and my clients is 2 sessions per week with approximately 72 hours of recovery between sessions. One session will be building the qualities of the front split position, and the other is built around the qualities of the side split position. And before anyone goes crazy in the comments, let me be very clear about this. I am not suggesting that you need to achieve the splits to unlock high kicks here. The splits is just a static stretch, guys. It's no different than any other static stretching exercise. The purpose of training the splits in this application is not necessarily to get all the way down to the floor. It's just simply a great way to improve our static flexibility in positions that directly translate to our high kicks. For example, this Taekwondo specific study took a look at youth athletes and used a side split measure alongside judged front kick and roundhouse kick performance. In boys, side split scores had a significant predictive value for right and left roundhouse kick quality. In girls, it was shown that left side split flexibility had significant predictive value for right roundhouse kick quality. The authors concluded that better splits flexibility is related to better technical performance of kicking techniques in Taekwondo. Now, to me, that's already pretty compelling evidence to support the use of splits training, but in the making of this video, I was having a conversation with a guy by the name of Dan Van Zant, who is probably the most knowledgeable person I've ever interacted with when it comes to flexibility research. That's literally his handle on Instagram, and if you're interested in this type of stuff, you should definitely go give him a follow. Now, Dan has worked with some of the OG pioneers of flexibility training for martial arts, such as Thomas Kurz and Bill Wallace, and he was telling me about this conversation that he had with Bill Wallace, who, by the way, has been teaching flexibility since 1960s. And Bill said that you will see plenty of people whose splits flexibility exceed their kick flexibility, but rarely, if ever, will you see someone who can kick with greater flexibility than they can achieve in the splits, unless they're twisting their body into ugly kicking shapes. So with all that in mind, there's some pretty strong resources to suggest that our splits flexibility has a direct correlation with our kicking flexibility. And that's why I think it's important to include it in our high kick flexibility routine. So to bring this back to structuring our flexibility routine, in addition to our daily stretch kick supplements, we also want to include 2 workouts per week, with one focusing on hip flexors and hamstrings with respect to the front split, and the other focusing on hip abductors and adductors with respect to the side split. Now, the general layout of these 2 sessions should start with some dynamic stretching to warm up and prepare the body, and then after that is when we implement the loaded eccentric stretches and our end range agonist exercises as the core of our session, and then I like to finish off with our static stretching at the end of the session, using the splits as our ultimate expression of overall high kick flexibility. Now, I know what you're thinking right now. This all sounds great, but what are the actual exercises I need to do, right? And while I could spend another half hour explaining exactly what you need to do, step by step, how to do it, I thought it would be better if I just organized it all into a free downloadable PDF for you. So if you look at the top line in the description of this video, you'll see a link to the High Kick Mobility Starter Pack, which is a free resource that packages all of the science that we just covered today into a structured, easy to follow training plan with tutorial videos for each and every exercise. That PDF is literally everything that you need to get started, and I spent a lot of time building it for you, so please make sure to take advantage of it. And before you go, I'd like to finish this video with one big caveat to all of this information, which is that your biology matters. The reality is that different individuals often need to bias different forms of flexibility training depending on their own deficits and limitations. Context and nuance are what ultimately determine what the best path is for the individual. But with that being said, achieving high kick flexibility is a relatively narrow problem. There are certain things that we know must occur in order to facilitate the movement pattern of a high kick, right? We know the antagonist muscles need to be sufficiently flexible to lengthen into position. We know the agonist muscles need to be strong enough to actively lift the leg up and express that range of motion in an active dynamic setting. And we know that the nervous system needs to be conditioned to express that range with speed and force. So no matter how you slice it, this training structure that I'm suggesting is directly training all of those qualities with a scientifically proven volume and frequency. The way I see it, a balanced plan covering all the different types of flexibility training is usually the best way to go in most cases, especially when we're giving broad advice to a large audience. Now, of course, there are always outliers with certain conditions and applications where your training may need to be more narrowly focused on specific exercises. And that's why I offer online coaching and custom programming to my clients, because a personalized training plan based on personal mobility assessments is always going to be your quickest path to achieving your goals. But if you're not ready for a coach right now and you want to try and unlock high kicks on your own, then I strongly believe that this video and the free PDF that's in the description contain everything that you need to get there on your own. So if you found this video useful, please make sure to like and subscribe to help this video find more people who could use it. And if you have any questions, definitely drop them in the comment section for me. Much love, guys. Maestro out.